Now that we've uploaded an image to Amazon ECR, it's time to take that image and then run the image as a container using Amazon ECS. In order to do so, we're going to have to create a few resources in order to get started. We're going to want to create a cluster, which is a collection of EC2 instances, or virtual servers, that our containers can run on. We'll also want to create a task definition, which is the configuration needed to run a task or a container on a cluster. Let's go ahead and start with the cluster first. We can go to Clusters under the ECS Service pane, and then click Create Cluster. We'll want to then select the EC2 Linux plus Networking cluster template, click Next, and then we'll want to name our cluster. We'll call this cluster Note-Taking Cluster, and then we'll provision it using on-demand EC2 instances. Then we'll want to make sure that we select the T2 Micro instance type, which qualifies under the free tier plan. We'll then leave the defaults, which are 1 for number of instances and 22 gigabytes for EBS storage. And then for this example, we're going to forego making a key pair, but if you want to use this on other projects, you'll probably want to create your own key pair so that you can SSH into your EC2 instances if something goes wrong. We'll also create a new VPC, which is a virtual private cloud, an isolated portion of the Amazon Web Services cloud. All of this is already set up for you with defaults, so we're going to go ahead and just leave all of these as is. We'll also make sure that this default set will create a new security group, as well as security group inbound rules in order to accept traffic coming into this cluster. Go ahead and click Create once you're done, and then wait for the note-taking cluster to be created. Once the cluster has finished creating, you can go ahead and scroll to the top and click View Cluster in order to take a look at our cluster. Once we've created the cluster, now we have to create a task definition in order to configure how our Docker image should run. To do so, let's go under Task Definitions and then create a new task definition. We're going to give this task definition the name Note-Taking Task. We're not going to give this task a role, and we're going to leave the network mode to default. And then under task size, let's go ahead and give this task a size. It'll allow us to specify the task memory and CPU units needed. We're going to give this task memory the size of 256 megabytes, and then right here for task CPU unit, we're just going to put 1. Going down, we're going to add a container definition. We can click Add Container. And then we need to specify a container name. So we're going to call this container Note-Taking App. And then for the image, we then have to go to ECR and then find the name of our image. I can also go back over here to the Note-Taking App directory and then type Docker images. And I can find the name of the image. You can also just go to ECR. So I'm going to put that image there and then add the latest tag. And then under memory limits, we're going to define the memory limit as 256 megabytes. And then for the port mapping, we now need to set this host port and container port. The host port is going to be the incoming port, which will be port 80 for all HTTP calls. And then the container port will map to port 3000. Now that that's done, let's go ahead and click Add. And we now have one container within this task definition. Everything else can be kept as the default, and then we can click Create. Let's see. Oh yeah, and then for the task CPU, that should actually be one virtual CPU. So let's go ahead and change that, then click Create. And now our task has been created successfully. We now have a note-taking task. Now to take this task definition and then run the task, we can go under Clusters, Note-Taking Cluster, and then we want to go ahead and create what's called a service. And we can configure a service in order to define how many copies of the task definition we want to run inside the cluster. So we're going to select the task definition note-taking task 1 to run in the note-taking cluster. We're going to call this note-taking service. We're going to run one of these tasks, and we're going to specify the minimum and maximum percent as the defaults. We can then click Next Step. We now have the option to set up a load balancer. For this example, we're going to have none. We can click Next Step. We're going to set this as the default. Click Next Step. Make sure everything looks right, and then Create Service. We can then view the note-taking service. And then wait a little while for the service to come up and running. After about a minute, we should have the note-taking task up and running. You may have to click refresh to actually get the list of tasks. Now, in order to then view this service, we need to go back to the cluster, click on ECS instances, and then click on the container instance. The EC2 instance. It'll then open up the EC2 instance in the EC2 management console. If you pull up the description pane, we'll see that we have a public DNS for this instance. If we copy this DNS and then paste it into our URL bar, we should be able to view our note-taking app. We now have the note-taking app running on ECS. Now that that's done, you can play around and continue experimenting with ECS, but ultimately you want to make sure that you tear down everything to make sure that you have nothing charged to your account. Because even if everything's under the free tier, if you leave everything up for more than a year, Amazon will start charging you. So in order to start deleting things, you can go to repositories, delete the repository. You can go to task definitions and delete the task definition under actions. Whoops. Maybe you can. So go ahead and make sure that under task definitions, you click on the revision and then go to actions deregister. And now there should be no task definitions. And then lastly, you want to click on clusters and then delete the cluster. So go and click on note-taking cluster, delete cluster, and then delete. After a few minutes, your cluster should have deleted successfully. Now, some benefits of hosting containers in AWS are that you have access to the wide AWS ecosystem. AWS provides a wide variety of different tools and services in order to make dynamic and scalable applications. Although do note that when dealing with ECS, there's a lot more complexity involved. If you're curious about learning more, make sure to read the ECS documentation on the AWS Docs website.